3.8 million tourists sort of come in every year. What sort of impact is that going to have, them not probably coming in this year for a wee while? How does that play out in the tourism industry?
Yeah, it'll be huge. And what we're seeing at the moment is, of course, in summer, Kiwis get out and about, and we see a lot of people who obviously, are spending a bit of money across the country, but it's just simply not enough. I think that we're expecting a gap of sort of between $7 and $9 billion, perhaps, in terms of what Kiwis might spend and what the international tourists might normally bring in. And you're right. I mean, that's nearly 4 million people that we don't have coming over the borders. That's enormous. And I think the struggle for this year is that it is going to be a bit of a roller coaster. We're still seeing activity that's holding up better than we might have expected, but those borders don't look like they're opening anytime soon. And so those tourism operators will be struggling for a while yet. And I think what that also means is sort of, where do we go from here? Because tourism was 5% of the economy. Now, that's not a huge amount, but it's also certainly not an insignificant amount in terms of activity. And I think what we also sort of probably should keep in mind is that even if we threw the borders open tomorrow, or when we eventually do, hopefully at the end of this year, start of next year, we don't get those 3.8 million people rushing back in just as usual. The global economy's taken a pretty big hit. They're stumbling a bit. And also we've seen a lot of direct flights to New Zealand cancelled. And what we've known over the last sort of 10 years or so is that those direct flights have been a real key one to get people into the country. So I think we're still going to struggle as we move forward. But it is also, I think, making the country have a little bit of a think about what is our proper or best economic structure at the moment. Is it that we have a lot of people employed in tourism, which is often more part-time work and slightly lower wages than otherwise? Or do we have, a bit more of a focus on digital technology and some of those areas where we continue to make money from overseas, but you don't have to it's not as resource intensive. You don't have to, burn fuel to bring people over on planes, and similarly, you can exchange software and bits and pieces. So I think there is a conversation now happening over how do we want to reposition the economy, because we have come through this quite well, and we've sort of got to embrace that advantage to make sure that it continues rather than just sort of fizzles out.
Yeah. Well, you've just made a really good point there about the jobs that often the tourism industry can provide. Let's say hospitality, being a waiter or a waitress, working in a kitchen, doing dishes, for things like those jobs compared to a tech job or whatever don't pay as much, etc. So I think that's a really good point you've made there. Like you mentioned, they're more part-time jobs or summer basis. Students like myself will go off and work from November to February, sort of thing. So I think that's a fantastic point there, actually. In terms of
the tough thing, though, for someone like you and others probably on the podcast, though, is that a lot of those jobs are perfect for students as they sort of during the summer holidays to make a bit of cash. And I think one of the things that I've really struggled with is talking to people over summer or as we headed into summer this year, who sort of said, well, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do. There's not as much work going. In some areas, the likes of people getting into supermarkets, there's still a fair bit because Kiwis are still spending there. But you do worry about how that changes, particularly that sort of student market or that very short-term work market, because not everyone can work a full-time job. And I think that's what we're seeing as well, is that in past economic hits, certainly the GFC, for example, you had the likes of, when the GFC hit, you immediately had workers they just lost their jobs outright. You sort of had a job or you didn't. Whereas now what we're seeing is that employers have said, actually, we want to keep workers on, but we can't keep them on full time. So maybe we'll push them back to part time. We'll cut some workers. We might reduce some pay. So how that's going to affect actual individuals and households is going to be quite a big challenge, I think, in terms of how we actually support people through this.
Definitely.